Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. I have known Ann Sample for years as a community leader and a friend, and I'm really thrilled to be partnering in this way. I think Navigate Forward, its services, its mindset, even its name is so appropriate for the times that we're facing. Going into 2021, on January 7th, I saw a posting that said, I had my 7-day free trial for 2021 and I've decided to cancel my subscription. So maybe you're feeling a bit of that, even though in our minds we know that we don't turn a page into a new year and all of a sudden the world changes. We have stability and clarity and calm. But I certainly wasn't expecting this. Once again, we find ourselves in a lot of turmoil, a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds. And this is a time when we have to gather together. One of the things that I have learned both through personal experience as well as my research, working with leaders and teams around the world, is that when life brings you to your knees, you need to look up and reach out. And that's really about what Navigate Forward is about. It is seeing what is ahead, what is possible, what is that new horizon, as well as being connected to others because we are navigating really rocky terrain. And we may think we have a map and a destination and a set of tools, but it is an iterative back and forth as we navigate through really, really rocky times. My own company, Journey Lead, is based on that same premise that it's not just about the destination, it is really about how we get there, our traveling companions, and the experience that we're having as we move forward. So I'm glad that you are here. I am glad to start this conversation, even in a virtual sense, knowing that over the last year, I've learned that the connections we make and even the intimacy that we build virtually is much greater and richer than I expected. That has been one of the delights of the way that I've had to change the way I do things. And I'm sure many of you are in that experience as well. So, let me just highlight some of the things we're going to talk about today. First of all, I want to talk about how crisis is different than difficult times or hardships or even very deep, significant loss that we go through. There's something about crisis where fundamentally our world has been shaken. And I call this the collapse, the complexity, and the catalyst. The collapse is that whatever kind of held our foundations together, whether it was societal infrastructure or our organizational processes, or even your own values and self identity, the structure of your family, of your day to day routines. In a crisis, that has been rocked. I want you to think of like a bridge that collapses. So, going back to what was isn't a possibility. You have to first restore, you have to rebuild. And there's where the opportunity lies. You're not just resetting, you're not just kind of going back to the dust settles and you get back to work. We have choices in a crisis, and not just at the end when we think we've come out the other side of it. We have choices even in the midst of turmoil about as I'm rebuilding, as I'm recalibrating, resetting my expectations about life and my career and my relationships. What are those foundations we want to put down? So we'll talk about that a bit. What are good ways to think about it so that you rebuild in a way that you're not sucked into thinking it's a typical problem to be solved? The second thing I want to talk about is your role in a crisis. We tend to lean into some stereotypical patterns when crisis happens. And if we're thinking about crisis as a problem on steroids, we often take our own strengths or our own accepted patterns, responses that have given us success in the past, and put those on steroids. So it's easy to become the hero or the martyr or the cowboy or the cheerleader. Again, based in probably some great innate talents, based in responses that have made you successful in the past, made you of use and of service to others. But in crisis, because we're dealing with something fundamentally different than just a hard, difficult problem, we have to broaden our responses. We have to broaden the roles that we play, and most importantly, how we see ourselves. to really navigate through that. And then finally, we're going to talk about what are some ways you can embrace ways of being, ways of thinking, and ways of connecting as we head into this year. Some of them will be surprisingly simple, small acts of kindness, creating space and grace for not being your best self every day, actually lowering your standards for what you achieve while raising the standards for who you are. I want you to walk away from our conversation today feeling more engaged and more connected as you navigate into the coming year. To drive home what we're up against in crisis, I want you to think about the difference between a chessboard and a surfboard. If we are seeing crisis fundamentally as a game to be won, like a chess game, or think of a math problem to solve, we really are looking for three things. First of all, certainty. What are the rules? What are the variables? What are the parameters that I'm working in to solve or win this thing? The second one is concentration. How can I focus and be persistent to get me across the finish line? And then finally, answers or a win. There is a proof that you're completing or that final move that leads you to victory. That is absolutely paralyzing set of assumptions to have during a crisis. In a crisis, it is much more like a surfer trying to ride a tidal wave that could absolutely wipe him or her out. So instead of certainty, the surfer needs stability. That's the first thing we need. We should look for clarity and stability rather than certainty in crisis. What is grounding us? Where is our center of gravity? The second thing, instead of concentration, which really assumes kind of a solo pursuit, it's much more important to focus on connection. When you think about the surfer connected to the board, connected to the ocean, they become very responsive. We need to be connected to our own emotions, to the people around us, and to the immediate environment that will be constantly changing. And then finally, there's certainly not an answer to crisis. We need to be looking instead for patterns. What about this feels familiar? Where have I seen this before? What are we learning as we go? Each wave, hopefully, we're gaining more confidence, more mastery in this crazy crest and ebb and crash that we're experiencing. Shifting the way we even think about the nature of crisis helps us change the story we're telling and the role that we play in the middle of one. So we've changed the metaphor we're using to understand crisis. It's not a chess game to win, a problem to be solved, a mountain to charge. It is a tidal wave to ride. Let's take that same energy and expand it to talk about what kind of story you tell yourself about crisis. Both the craziness, the upset of 2020, but also your history of adversity and how you've learned from adversity. That'll help us understand the role that you cast yourself in, at least historically, when crisis emerges. Stories are a fantastic way to explore experience because it really emphasizes the emotions and even the deep mythology that we have about the hero's journey. I mentioned before that some very typical roles that we come into are the hero. We ride in the white horse. We hear the ringing of crisis, and that is our call to action to come and save or care or battle the giants on behalf of others. Certainly admirable, but in crisis, we know that it is not adequate. And actually, over time, it creates a dependency on you, on the perceived power that you have over the universe with those around you. You don't want to be a hero during crisis. You want to be human. You want to be authentic and connected, not necessarily victorious. The other role, based on the story that we tell ourselves, is the martyr. It's a less happy version of the hero because it assumes that this weight is on my shoulders alone. It feeds into the myth that you actually have the power or the strength or the responsibility to save others. Why the hero can come from that achiever's dilemma where if you just rise to the challenge and work harder and longer and faster, you can be the hero. The martyr often comes out of what I call the caretaker's dilemma, that if you're compassionate enough or attentive enough or nurturing enough, you can resolve this crisis. And that's a really ultimately limiting and draining role to play. The other two roles that I see a lot, especially with leaders, is one, the cowboy, the idea that you do have the courage and the self assurance to shake things up. You actually get it that the old processes and problem solving approaches are not going to be adequate. And so you're willing to be a bit of a loose cannon. Remember, during crisis, what we need first and foremost is stability. We need predictability in the humanness and authenticity of our leaders. This is not the time to throw grenades, to be a provocateur. We need to be connected, again, authentic and loving and open, but not a cowboy just for the sake of rallying the troops. And then finally, and what's really tricky is not being the cheerleader. Of course, we want to lift people up, we want to raise the morale. But cheerleading during times of crisis often comes off as toxic positivity. It actually is signaling to the people around you that the very tough, difficult emotions they're feeling, like fear and insecurity and worry and even sorrow, are somehow not acceptable. They need to pony up, put on a bright face, and move forward with optimism. That's just not realistic. And in fact, it's really limiting during crisis. You want to go not for positivity, but for authenticity and allow a full range of emotions to surface in your family, in your team, in your organization, but also within you. When we get sucked into the hero, the martyr, the cowboy, or the cheerleader, we are actually cutting off our full emotional resources that allow us to respond to complexity. We have to play many roles during a crisis. Most importantly, ourselves by staying grounded, again, the stability, connected, responsive in the moment to those around us, and to look for patterns in ourselves that are maybe wirings we have. So, for example, I want you to think, what about this crisis or scenario is familiar to me? What part of Groundhog Day learning am I experiencing? What do I know about myself, about how I get sucked into playing one of these roles when the going gets tough? Again, those roles may have served you well in the past, they may have benefited those around you. But in crisis, we need to be open to a bigger toolkit, a broader repertoire of responses, rather than just some old frameworks for solving problems that we think we have figured out. Many years ago, NPR had a segment called This I Know to Be True, and they would interview people from all walks of life about fundamentally in their heart of hearts what they knew to be true based on their own life experience. So it didn't have to be true for everyone. It didn't have to be proven by some experiment or social science approach. It was what walking day to day in their footsteps over the course of a lifetime had taught them. So, this final piece about words of wisdom that I can offer, I want to share from my own life experience, not from research or being a consultant or working at Gallup. This final part is what I know to be true, certainly because of what I've learned from others, but most importantly, for my own lived experience of crisis. 5 years ago, in April of 2015, we very suddenly lost our 9-year-old son, Ben. It was a weekend of a hockey tournament. He and his buddies had been talking smack about the championship game that was going to happen that Sunday afternoon. And as I was with Ben, he suddenly started gasping for air. And over just a matter of minutes, his airway closed. We found out later that he had an asymptomatic and undiagnosed infection in his trachea, along with influenza B, even though he had had the flu shot that year. You don't have to be a parent to imagine the worst nightmare of actually holding your child in a way that the entire world collapses. And everything that we think about um, life and nature and just our heritage and our family was turned upside down for us. Now, in the course of the 5 years since, we have walked a devastating but also remarkable path of loss and healing, connection, grief, and also some deep wisdom and compassion about what it means to recover from the worst thing that could happen to you. Of course, there's a sad irony that 5 years later, the entire world is experiencing a virus that is wreaking havoc on our society. But here are some things that I want to share with you that I know to be true 5 years out in this journey of devastating loss. The first one is that whatever is good and true and meaningful before a crisis will save your life during and through a crisis. So if it's meaningful work or a strong marriage or partnership or a loving community or a faith, those are the things that provide the stability that you need when the tidal wave hits. It is something that you want to be investing in before your life is shaken to its core. And I'm so grateful that I did have and do have the kind of community and family and solid base that has become a lifeline in more profound ways than I could have ever expected. The second truth that I've experienced, that I've learned, is the importance of space and grace. Our minister, John Ross, first offered that to us in those first horrific hours and days at Children's Hospital. He said that we really need to be able to lean into one another, not be strong for one another, but find strength in one another, so that we didn't have to put up a facade about being our best selves or being stoic. We had the space to feel whatever range of emotions that would come up in waves. And that we also had the grace to accept each other when admittedly we were not our best self. We were racked with just the very human, universal truth of suffering and heartache. That kind of space and grace I see in families and teams and whole organizations. It is wonderful, it is life-giving, it is engaging in the best of times. But during times of crisis and turmoil, it's an absolutely essential attitude and spirit to bring to one another. And then finally, the truth that I know from my own path is that both joy and sorrow can live together, and that we don't have to resolve our sorrow in order to feel joy. Certainly in those early weeks and months, I thought I could never imagine being happy again. I still had the myth that I would somehow resolve grief in order to build a new life. I've learned since then that we never resolve the greatest losses that we experience. We reconcile our lives now to the loss that we've experienced in the past. And the way that I feel like our family has survived and in so many ways are absolutely thriving is because our hearts expanded to allow the realities of both joy and sorrow to exist simultaneously. I feel that we are more compassionate, we are more bold, we are more vulnerable and realistic about the uncertainties of life, but we are also more wholehearted in our embracing of life and the relationships that we have around us. I know that you have things that you know to be true coming out of 2020. The importance of people you love, the new ways and resilience that you were able to find to restructure your life and your days and your finances and your job. I also know that it wasn't just 2020 that taught you. You have a lifetime of rich, wonderful experiences, but also heartache, loss, and perhaps even crisis. My hope for you, not only as we go into this next year, but as you look in your past and what you've learned, the patterns that you see, the connections that you've made, and the deep roots of stability that you've cultivated over the years. My hope is that you can rally those resources, that you look forward, and that you reach out to others to have a year where you can truly thrive.